So evolution, again, it's genetic change over time. We need to get back to that basic definition because that's all evolution says. That's all Darwin was saying, that organisms change over time and natural selection is how they do it. So natural selection was Darwin's only idea. The idea of things changing over time had been around before Darwin, but that it happened through natural selection is his idea. We need to put a little bit more modern terminology on that. So genetic change over time equates to change of allele frequencies. So you remember alleles, those are DNA characteristics in the DNA. So change in those frequencies in a population. So evolution is change of the allele frequencies in a population. An example, if I looked at this tiger population over here, maybe I'm a zookeeper or a reserve keeper, and most of my tigers are the regular kind of orange colored tigers. But people who come to my reserve, they want to see the white tigers. So if I look at the DNA for white versus the DNA for orange tigers in my zoo, perhaps I only have a small sliver of white tigers and quite a few genes or DNA that says to make it a orange tiger. I want to change my allele frequencies over time to increase the number of tigers in my population or the number of alleles that have the white. I could do this several ways in my zoo population. I could call up another zoo and ask to trade some animals for more white tigers, or I could breed and over time have more and more baby white tigers. So this change in the proportion of the population that contains the white information is evolution. The 4 agents of change, so 4 things that cause evolution. The first is mutation. So just either spontaneous or chemically caused changes in the DNA. And we've looked at mutation a little bit before and we'll look at it some more. Genetic drift, because it's all random, how crossover occurs, how things are fertilized, what genes you pick up. It's like tossing dice, what you get in the offspring. So that can cause change. Migration, so organisms leaving one area and moving to a new area. That'd be the equivalent of shipping more white tigers to my zoo. So migration can cause a allele frequency change in a population. And natural selection, so some organisms surviving better based on their characteristics than others in my population. We'll go through each of these. So first of all, mutation is a change in the DNA sequence. So here's our DNA strand and a normal strand of DNA. We can see here's our A's, G's, C's, and T's, pairs. A normal DNA sequence will make messenger RNA to make a protein, and that will make a normal protein. In this case, this normal protein gives us a normal frog. However, if we have a mutation, maybe it's chemically induced or induced by radiation, that changes that sequence of DNA, when that's passed through our messenger RNA and into our protein, that's going to cause a change in the protein. Maybe this protein change causes a mutant phenotype. So this frog has way too many legs. So now it's a mutant phenotype. And mutations are things that can be passed on to offspring in their gametes. They could be harmful. I don't know that those extra legs are going to benefit the frog at all. They could be beneficial, or they could be completely neutral. In fact, most mutations are completely neutral. Because if we remember our genetic code, if it's just changing this, any of that third letter, it could still give you the same amino acid. And we know there are lots of mutagens out there. It could be spontaneous mutations, could be chemical mutations, could be radiation induced, and we've talked about those in a previous chapter. Another thing that can change the allele frequencies in a population is just genetic drift. It's like rolling a dice, random changes. These are not related to reproductive success or the ability to find food or anything else, and you see them more often in small populations. And it can lead to fixation, so you can completely lose one characteristic from a population just randomly. So maybe we have a population of cleft chin versus smooth chin individuals, just randomly over time, not through any other preference or anything like that. Just more and more of the smooth chin people just happen by chance to pass on their genes or to have more offspring than the cleft chin individuals. So gradually over time, the number of smooth chin versus cleft chin in my population will change. It is possible, especially if it's a small population, to completely lose that cleft chin characteristic if they just don't leave any descendants. And that's called genetic drift, just random changes. There are a couple special types of genetic drift. One is the founder effect and the other is a population bottleneck, and we'll talk about both of those too. So first of all, the founder effect, this is where you have a small group that leaves a larger population. So they found a different population. So they have a small number of people leaving this really big population. Whatever genes that they carry with them, then that's going to make up the entirety of the new population. This is true for having extra fingers and toes in Amish populations here in the US. Their original population in Europe had very few people with extra fingers and toes, so a sixth digit on their hands and feet. But when the population that moved to the US migrated, some of those six-fingered individuals came with them. So now they make up a larger proportion of this small population. So having extra fingers and toes is very common here in the US in Amish populations because of the founder effect. A population bottleneck occurs when you have a big population and some factor, so famine, diseases, rapid climate change, that kills off about 90% of the population. And it goes through a bottleneck. You can think of it as a jar filled with marbles with a narrow opening, and those marbles are all different colors showing lots of genetic diversity, but since 90% of them die off, you tip your bottle upside down, shake it a couple of times, and the few marbles that fall out, that's all you have left in your population at the end. So we have a large diverse population, most of them die, only a few survive, and that's all we have now for genetic makeup. So we've lost completely our purple and yellow alleles, and we have a few green, but mostly the blue. So we lose a lot of our genetic diversity. This has occurred in cheetahs. So based on genetic analysis, because there's very few cheetahs left on the planet, pretty much all of them that exist, we've darted and tranquilized them and drawn blood and done DNA analysis. So we have DNA from virtually every cheetah on the planet, and it's all very similar. In fact, the DNA of different cheetahs is so similar that you could transfer things like do skin grafts. So take skin from one cheetah and transplant it to a different cheetah, and they're so similar that the immune system doesn't recognize that it's different. They think it belongs, and so they don't have any immune response to the organs of other cheetahs because they're so similar. So it's estimated that about 10,000 years ago, nearly all of them died for one of these factors or a combination of them, and only approximately 12 cheetahs survived that bottleneck. And even though since that time, obviously we have more than 12 cheetahs on the planet now, so the population numbers have increased, but there hasn't been enough time for random mutations to build up genetic diversity again. So they lost all of their genetic variation, so they're virtually identical genetically. Migration is another way to change the allele frequencies in a population, and that's just movement of organisms between populations. So we have this population 1 and 2, and the number of green and blue alleles is different in the two populations. If a group leaves population 1 and moves into population 2, then both populations are affected. They both have different allele frequencies after the move. And since evolution is change in allele frequencies in a population, that's evolution, because each of these populations is now different. The other thing is natural selection. Now this was Darwin's idea. And this is all Darwin came up with, that this change over time occurred by natural selection. It's the entirety of his idea. First of all, for natural selection to occur, you need variation in traits. We've mentioned the neck lengths, and that's different. So lots of different characteristics in humans are different. So lots of traits in humans could be acted on by natural selection. It has to be heritable, so it has to be in the DNA and be passed on to your offspring. And there has to be different reproductive success based on that trait. So that struggle for existence that Darwin noticed. So here we have DNA representing populations. We've got lots of different alleles in our population. It's inherited, so the green allele is passed on to the offspring, so are all the other colors. Over time, based on natural selection, if the individuals with this blue allele, whatever characteristic it codes for, leave more offspring, maybe they have the ability to gather more food, or they build a slightly different nest if they're a bird that stays in the tree better, and so they leave more offspring. The offspring survive. If they have a slightly better characteristic, they're going to leave more offspring. Over time, that's going to affect the allele frequencies of the population. If the blue always leaves more offspring, and the purple always leaves the least amount of offspring, over time, this purple is going to become very, very rare, or even go extinct, die off altogether. You won't see that in the population anymore, and you'll have more and more blues over time. So that's natural selection. Requirements for natural selection in a little more detail. You need variation in a trait. Lots of traits have variation. So these dogs are all different sizes, all different types of coat, color and hair type. So lots of variation in dogs. Humans also show lots and lots of natural variation in a variety of traits. It has to be inherited, so be able to pass it on. So obviously these two individuals look very similar. Her characteristics for appearance are in the DNA and were passed on to her daughter. So requirements for natural selection are variation and heritability, and also different reproductive success. Now this is going back to kind of the DNA we looked at before, but giving it an actual example. We have these rabbits here. The blue is the fastest rabbit, green is a rabbit that can run at an intermediate speed, and yellow is the slowest rabbit. When they reproduce, they pass on that speed gene to their offspring. They're going to have different reproductive success if there are predators in the environment. So we've got a hungry fox. It's going to be able to catch and eat the slow rabbits first, so these yellow rabbits. And if you get eaten by a fox, you can't leave offspring, so you die off out of the population. So first of all, our yellow population is going to be reduced and eventually eliminated, and the fox is going to go after the green. And then eventually it might try chasing down the blue. But this presence of the fox affects how many offspring each of these are going to leave. So that's a different reproductive success based on the characteristic of being able to run fast. The idea of how traits are inherited and passed on over time was put together separately by two individuals, Wilhelm Weinberg and G.H. Hardy, and they were both mathematicians. In fact, Hardy was a friend of R.C. Punnett, who you can thank for the Punnett Square. And these two, Hardy and Punnett, were actually out on the golf course, I believe, one day, and Punnett asked Hardy if the allele for brown eyes is dominant over the allele for blue eyes, sorry about the typo, why doesn't a population eventually become all brown-eyed? And Hardy didn't know. And so he went back home and started working out a mathematical formula to answer his buddy's question. Why doesn't the population eventually all become brown-eyed? Why don't you lose that blue-eyed characteristic from the population? And he developed what's become known as the Hardy-Weinberg law, because Weinberg came up with the same idea. So the Hardy-Weinberg law that uses frequencies, so P and Q, to represent the alleles in a population. And we will look at this a little bit more in lab. So we'll actually do a Hardy-Weinberg game and look at why we don't lose certain alleles in the population. So in class we'll look at Hardy-Weinberg, and we'll look at populations evolving, and we'll see how things like X-Men, although a very cute movie, could not actually happen because populations evolve, not individuals.